The silence in a marriage can be louder than any argument, especially when it lasts long enough to make a woman forget what her husband's voice sounds like. Sophie Bennett stood barefoot on the cold marble floor of the penthouse kitchen, her hand resting lightly on her swollen abdomen, as the city lights of Chicago shimmered beyond the glass walls. It was exactly 11:47 p.m., and the only sound in the entire apartment was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of a designer clock Ethan Callaway had once said represented discipline. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm the tightness in her chest. 8 months pregnant, Sophie had learned to measure time not by hours, but by absence. Ethan had not come home again. Not last night. Not the night before. 3 days had passed since she had last seen him in person, and even that memory felt like it belonged to another life. She reached for her phone on the counter and hesitated for a moment before dialing. It rang once, twice, then a cold automated transfer. A moment later, his assistant answered. Mr. Callaway is in back-to-back executive meetings and has instructed not to be disturbed. Sophie closed her eyes. It is almost midnight, she said softly. I understand, Mrs. Callaway, the assistant replied politely, but he is unavailable. The line disconnected before she could respond. Sophie placed the phone down carefully, as if any sudden movement might crack the fragile control she had left. Her fingers brushed over the kitchen island where Ethan usually left his keys, though lately the space had remained empty. No jacket. No briefcase. No trace of him. She remembered when this kitchen used to feel alive. When he would stand behind her, one hand around her waist, teasing her about burning toast while pretending he did not enjoy those quiet mornings. That version of him felt like a memory she was no longer allowed to touch. Upstairs, the penthouse felt even larger than usual. Every room stretched with silence. Sophie walked slowly into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. Her baby moved gently inside her, a soft reminder that she was not alone, even if everything else suggested otherwise. She whispered, "He is just busy. That is all." But her voice did not sound convinced. The elevator dinged suddenly, slicing through the silence like a blade. Sophie's head snapped toward the hallway. Her heart reacted before her mind did. Footsteps followed. Steady, controlled, familiar. Ethan Callaway stepped inside, still wearing his tailored black suit, tie loosened just slightly, his expression unreadable. He paused when he saw her sitting there. "You are still awake," he said flatly. Sophie stood slowly, one hand supporting her lower back. "It is almost midnight, Ethan." "I had meetings," he replied, walking past her toward the bar. "You always have meetings," she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water, as if the conversation required no urgency at all. Sophie studied him. The man she married had once looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered in a room full of billion-dollar deals. Now he looked at her like another obligation on a schedule that never ended. "I called your office," she said. "They said you could not be disturbed." "That is correct," Ethan answered. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but it carried no humor. "I am your wife." For the first time, his gaze shifted toward her. Not warm. Not cold. Just distant. "And I am running a company that employs over 8,000 people," he said. "Things are complicated right now." Sophie nodded slowly, as if absorbing something heavier than disappointment. "Everything is complicated with you now," she said. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel physical. Ethan set the glass down. "You should rest. The doctor said you are close to your due date." "The doctor also said stress is not good for me," she replied, her voice softer now. "But you were not there for that appointment either." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, gone too quickly to name. Before he could respond, her phone on the table lit up. Once, then again. A notification preview appeared on the screen. Sophie's breath caught slightly as she turned her head. Ethan noticed the change in her expression immediately. "What is that?" he asked. She hesitated, then reached for the phone. On the screen was a message. From Dr. Ryan Carter. "Sophie, your test results came in. We need to talk as soon as possible." Ethan's eyes locked onto the screen. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Who is Ryan Carter? He asked, voice lower now. Sophie swallowed. He is my doctor. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then at the message again. Something in his jaw tightened. At midnight, he said slowly. Your doctor is texting you at midnight. Sophie frowned slightly. It is probably important. But Ethan was no longer listening. His gaze sharpened, colder than before. And for the first time that night, the silence between them stopped feeling empty. It started feeling dangerous. Ethan did not move right away. He kept his eyes fixed on the glowing phone screen as if the words were refusing to settle into logic. The name Dr. Ryan Carter stayed there like a stain he could not ignore. Sophie stood a few feet away, one hand resting on her abdomen, watching him carefully. The air between them had shifted again, tighter now, sharper. You never mentioned a doctor texting you at midnight, Ethan said finally, his voice controlled but low. Sophie blinked slowly. Because there is nothing unusual about it. He is monitoring my pregnancy. At midnight, Ethan repeated. She exhaled, frustration flashing in her eyes. Ethan, I am 8 months pregnant. Things come up. I do not schedule when my body decides to act differently. That sentence landed harder than she expected. Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly. And you think it is normal for your doctor to contact you directly instead of going through proper channels? Sophie stepped closer, her voice steady but tired. I think it is normal when someone cares about whether my baby is safe. That word, safe, seemed to shift something in him. But instead of softening, Ethan turned away, walking toward the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city was endless, bright, indifferent. So this is what it has come to, he said quietly. Sophie frowned. What are you talking about? Ethan did not answer immediately. His reflection in the glass looked distant, almost unfamiliar to her. A man texting you at midnight. While I am gone working. Sophie let out a small disbelieving laugh. You are not gone working, Ethan. You are gone living in your company. The words hung in the air. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ethan turned back. I saw the message preview, he said. It said we need to talk. That is not a routine checkup message. Sophie stared at him, realization slowly hardening into disbelief. You went through my phone. It lit up in front of me, he corrected. I did not go looking for it. You did not have to, she said, voice tightening. You already decided what it meant. Ethan stepped closer now. Not aggressive, not loud, but controlled in a way that made the room feel smaller. Tell me the truth, Sophie, he said. How long has this been going on? She froze. What are you even implying? Do not insult me by pretending you do not understand, he replied. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Sophie shook her head slowly. You think I am hiding something? Ethan did not answer immediately, but his expression did not deny it either. That was enough. Sophie's voice cracked slightly, though she tried to steady it. I am carrying your child. I can barely walk across this room without feeling exhausted. And you are standing here questioning me about a doctor. Ethan's jaw tightened again. I am questioning what I saw. You saw a message, she said. That is all. At midnight, he repeated again, like the timing itself was evidence. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, something breaking quietly in her expression. Do you hear yourself right now? The question stayed unanswered. Ethan turned slightly, pacing once across the living room, his thoughts unreadable. I do not like surprises, he said finally. Especially not when they involve you. Sophie frowned. That is not protection. That is control. The word landed hard. Ethan stopped walking. For a second the room went completely still. Then his phone buzzed. Once. Twice. A second notification from Dr. Ryan Carter appeared on Sophie's phone screen where she had placed it back on the counter. Ethan saw it again. His eyes narrowed. I want to know exactly who he is, he said. Sophie's voice dropped, quiet but firm. He is my doctor. That is all he is. Ethan did not look convinced. And in that moment the distance between them did not feel emotional anymore. It felt like something neither of them knew how to cross. Ethan did not sleep that night. The penthouse felt too large, too quiet, as if every wall had absorbed the tension between them and was now reflecting it back at him. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the city lights of Chicago, but his mind kept circling back to the same image. Sophie's phone lighting up. That name. Dr. Ryan Carter. And the timing. Always the timing. At exactly 12:13 a.m., when most people were asleep, when nothing innocent usually arrived. Behind him, Sophie had retreated to the bedroom, but neither of them had truly left the conversation. It lingered in the air like a weight neither was willing to drop. Ethan finally exhaled and turned away from the window. He walked down the hallway, stopping outside the bedroom door. It was slightly open. Sophie was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands resting protectively over her abdomen. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "We are not done talking," Ethan said quietly. Sophie did not look up immediately. "We were never talking," she replied. That stopped him for a moment. He stepped inside. "I want clarity," he said. Sophie finally raised her eyes to him. "You want control," she corrected softly. The words hung between them. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I want to understand what is happening around you." Sophie let out a slow breath. "Nothing is happening around me. I am pregnant. That is what is happening." Ethan took a step closer. "Then explain the messages." Sophie stood slowly, one hand still supporting her lower back. "You saw a notification. That is all you saw. You did not see the context. You did not see the full conversation. You did not even ask me before deciding what it meant." Ethan's jaw tightened again. "So explain it to me now." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "Dr. Carter is my obstetric specialist," she said carefully. "He has been monitoring my pregnancy since the second trimester because I was flagged for potential complications." Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. "Complications?" "Yes," she said quietly. "Blood pressure instability, stress sensitivity, risk factors that require close monitoring." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Not accusatory, not defensive, just heavy with information neither of them had fully processed before. Ethan looked away briefly, as if recalibrating something internally. "Why was I not informed?" he asked. Sophie gave a small, tired laugh. "You were informed, Ethan. Through emails, appointment reminders, records I sent to your assistant weeks ago." She paused. "You did not attend a single one." That landed harder than anything else so far. Ethan did not respond immediately. He turned slightly, running a hand through his hair. "I did not realize it was that serious," he said finally. Sophie nodded slowly. "That is the problem. You do not realize anything until it becomes urgent enough to interrupt your schedule." The words were not loud, but they were sharp. Ethan looked back at her. "I am trying to protect you," he said. Sophie's expression softened for just a second, but her voice stayed firm. "Then start by trusting me instead of interrogating me." A silence followed again. Longer this time. Ethan stepped back slightly, as if giving space to something unfamiliar. "I saw the word talk in that message," he said more quietly. "I thought." He stopped himself. Sophie waited. "You thought what?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. For a moment, something unguarded flickered in his expression. "I thought I was being replaced," he admitted. Sophie blinked slowly, surprised by the honesty. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "Ethan," she said softly, "there is no one replacing you. There is only a doctor making sure I do not lose our baby." The word "our" shifted the atmosphere again. Ethan looked down for a moment, absorbing it. Outside the window, the city continued moving like nothing inside this apartment mattered. But inside everything had changed shape. He finally spoke again, voice quieter now. "I should have been there." Sophie did not answer immediately. She walked back toward the bed and sat down again, exhausted. "Yes," she said simply. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just honest. Ethan stayed standing for a moment longer before slowly sitting on the edge of the chair across from her. The distance between them was still there, but it no longer felt like accusation. It felt like something they might have to rebuild from the ground up. And for the first time since midnight, the silence between them was no longer sharp. It was uncertain. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold air conditioning, the kind of place where time moved differently, slower, heavier, as if every second was measured in breath and heartbeat. Sophie sat in the private consultation room, her hands resting on her abdomen, while Ethan stood near the window, staring at nothing again. Neither of them had spoken for almost 5 minutes. Then a soft knock broke the silence. The door opened and Dr. Ryan Carter stepped inside, holding a digital tablet and a thin folder of medical records. He looked calm, professional, completely unaware of the storm he was about to walk into. "Good evening, Sophie," he said gently. Then his eyes shifted to Ethan. "Mr. Calloway." Ethan's expression tightened instantly. "You are Dr. Carter," he said. It was not a question. Ryan nodded. "Yes. I have been overseeing Sophie's prenatal care." Sophie looked between them quickly. "Ethan, this is exactly what I told you. He is my doctor." Ethan did not take his eyes off Ryan. "You texted my wife at midnight." The room went still. Ryan paused, clearly processing the tone, then glanced at Sophie for confirmation. "I sent her test updates," he said calmly. "There were irregular readings last night. I needed her to come in for immediate monitoring." Ethan stepped forward slightly. "At midnight?" Ryan kept his voice steady. "Yes, because her blood pressure spiked earlier in the evening. Waiting until morning would not have been medically responsible." Sophie exhaled slowly. "I tried to tell you that," she said quietly, looking at Ethan. "But you were already convinced of something else." Ethan did not respond right away. His jaw tightened, then relaxed slightly as he turned back to Dr. Carter. "Show me everything," he said. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed the tablet on the desk and turned the screen toward them. Charts. Readings. Trends over the last several weeks. Sophie's condition was clearly documented. Ethan studied it in silence. The confidence he carried into boardrooms seemed absent now, replaced by something more restrained, almost unsettled. "This is not minor," he said finally. Ryan shook his head. "No, it is not. That is why I have been monitoring her closely." Sophie watched Ethan carefully. "This is why I did not want stress," she said softly. "And what did you think arguing with me all night was doing?" Ethan looked at her then. For a moment, there was no corporate distance, no suspicion. Just something quieter. "I did not know," he said. Sophie nodded. "That is the point." The words did not accuse. They simply existed. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, then looked back at the medical chart. "What are the risks?" he asked. Ryan responded without hesitation. "Preterm labor if stress continues. Elevated risk of complications if her condition is not stabilized." The room felt smaller after that sentence. Ethan slowly sat down in the chair across from Sophie, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. "And you did not think I needed to know this sooner?" he asked. Sophie looked down for a moment. "I did," she said honestly. "But you were never available long enough for the conversation to matter." That silence hit differently. Ethan did not argue this time. Instead, he looked at Sophie, really looked at her, as if seeing the last few months from a perspective he had avoided. "I thought I was protecting you by working," he said quietly. Sophie shook her head slightly. "And I thought I was protecting myself by not bothering you." Dr. Carter cleared his throat gently, sensing the emotional shift. "Right now the priority is stability," he said. "Not interpretation." Ethan nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" The question was simple, but it carried something new in it. Not control. Not suspicion. Ryan answered directly. Presence. Support. Reduce stress for Sophie. That includes emotional environment as much as physical. Sophie gave a small, tired smile at that. "So basically," she said, "you need him to actually be here." Ethan did not respond immediately, but he did not look away this time either. For the first time since midnight, the misunderstanding between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a mistake they might still have time to correct. Sometimes the truth does not hurt because it is cruel. It hurts because it arrives too late to fix what was already broken. The hospital room had gone quiet again after Dr. Carter left, leaving only the faint hum of equipment and the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor. Sophie remained seated on the edge of the bed, her hands resting protectively over her abdomen, while Ethan stood near the window with his phone in his hand, staring at something that no longer looked like a threat but like evidence of his own negligence. For the first time that night, his expression was not defensive. It was unsettled. He slowly unlocked his phone again and opened his email inbox. There were dozens of unread messages, all marked urgent, all ignored. Appointment reminders, medical updates, notes from Dr. Carter, even a flagged message from Sophie sent 3 days ago that he had never opened. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he exhaled sharply. "I never saw these," he said quietly. Sophie did not look up immediately. "I sent them," she replied. "I asked your assistant to make sure you received them." Ethan frowned slightly. "My assistant?" Sophie nodded. "Yes. Every time I tried to reach you directly, it went through your office first." That detail landed differently. Ethan turned slightly, his mind already shifting. What did she say exactly? Sophie hesitated. That you were unavailable. That you were in meetings. That you were traveling most of the time. Ethan stared at the screen again, then slowly lowered the phone. "That is not how communication is supposed to work," he said. Sophie gave a small, tired laugh. "That is how your world works." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different. Less like conflict, more like realization. Ethan finally walked away from the window and sat down on the chair closer to Sophie. Not across the room. Not at a distance. Closer. "I did not realize how isolated you were becoming," he said. Sophie looked at him then. "I was not becoming isolated," she said softly. "I was already there." The words were not dramatic. They were factual. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, as if absorbing something heavier than blame. "That is on me," he said. Sophie did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied him quietly. The man who ran a global company. The man who controlled negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And yet, in this room, he looked like someone realizing he had lost track of something far more fragile than business. "I am not trying to punish you," she said finally. "I just need you to understand what this has felt like." Ethan nodded once. "I do," he said. But his voice carried uncertainty now, not authority. Sophie leaned back slightly against the pillows. "When I told you about the doctor texting me, I was not hiding anything," she continued. "I was trying to manage my own stress so I would not make things worse." Ethan looked up at her. "And I made it worse." Sophie did not disagree. That silence was answer enough. Ethan ran a hand through his hair again, slower this time, as if trying to reset something internally. "From now on," he said carefully, "I want full access to your medical updates." Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly. "Access," she repeated. Ethan corrected himself immediately. "No, that is not what I mean." He paused. "I want to be involved. Properly. Not through filtered updates. Not through assumptions. I want to be present." Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "That is a start," she said quietly. Ethan exhaled, almost as if he had been holding his breath since the moment he saw that midnight message. Outside the hospital window, the city lights continued to move as if nothing inside this room had shifted. But everything had. Ethan looked back at Sophie, and for the first time since the misunderstanding began, he was not searching for proof of betrayal. He was trying to understand how he had missed the truth sitting right in front of him. And Sophie, though still exhausted, no longer looked like someone standing alone in that truth. The night had grown deeper, and the hospital corridor outside their private room had quieted into that strange kind of silence that only exists after emotional exhaustion. Sophie had finally settled into a reclined position on the hospital bed, her breathing slower now, though still careful, as if even rest required effort. Ethan remained seated nearby, no longer standing guard at the window, but not fully relaxed either. He was watching her. Not with suspicion anymore, but with something closer to awareness. A knock interrupted the stillness. A nurse entered quietly, holding a tablet and a small chart. "Mrs. Calloway, we are ready for a brief fetal monitoring update," she said gently. Sophie nodded and shifted slightly. Ethan immediately stood. "I will come with you," he said. The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Of course. The hallway outside was softly lit, the kind of lighting designed to reduce stress, but it only made everything feel more surreal. Sophie was wheeled a short distance down to a monitoring room while Ethan walked beside her, staying close without speaking. When they arrived, the nurse attached gentle sensors and adjusted the screen. The soft rhythmic sound of a heartbeat filled the room. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment. Ethan stood still. That sound was not something he was used to hearing. Not like this. Not so constant. Not so vulnerable. Everything looks stable for now, the nurse said. But we will continue close monitoring overnight, due to earlier fluctuations. Ethan nodded slowly. Thank you. Sophie opened her eyes and looked toward the screen. The heartbeat continued steadily, like proof of something both fragile and real. It sounds stronger than before, she said softly. The nurse smiled faintly. That is a good sign. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor. For a moment he said nothing. Then quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, he said, I did not know I was missing this. Sophie turned her head slightly toward him. You were not here, she said, not accusing. Just stating truth. Ethan nodded once. I know. The nurse finished her adjustments and left them alone for a few minutes. The room felt smaller again, but not uncomfortable. Just heavy with presence. Ethan finally spoke. When I saw that message last night, he said, I did not think about a doctor. I did not think about your health. He paused. Sophie watched him carefully. What did you think about? She asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. I thought I was losing you. The honesty in his voice was quiet but unfiltered. Sophie did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked back at the monitor where their child's heartbeat continued steadily. You were never losing me, she said softly. You were just not looking at me. That sentence landed without resistance. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly. That is not something I can fix in one night, he said. Sophie nodded. I know. Another silence followed, but it was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with recognition. Ethan finally pulled a chair closer to her bedside. Not across the room. Not at a distance. Close enough that he could see her clearly without effort. Tell me what you need, he said. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Consistency, she replied. Not intensity. Not sudden changes. Just consistency. Ethan nodded slowly. I can do that. Sophie studied him, as if deciding whether she believed him. Then she gave a small, tired exhale. Start by not disappearing for entire days, she said. A faint, almost reluctant smile crossed Ethan's face. That is fair. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, filling the space between them. For the first time since the midnight message, neither of them was trying to interpret hidden meanings or defend assumptions. They were simply present in the same moment. And in that stillness, something fragile began to shift, not resolved, not healed, but no longer breaking. The hospital room felt quieter after the heartbeat monitoring ended, as if the world itself had decided to lower its voice out of respect. Sophie remained in bed, resting but no longer asleep, her hand loosely resting on her abdomen. Ethan had not left her side since they returned from the monitoring room. He sat in the chair beside her now, leaning forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. There was a different kind of stillness between them, not the sharp silence of misunderstanding anymore, but something slower, heavier, more reflective. Then Ethan's phone vibrated softly on the table. Once, twice. He looked at it, then picked it up. The caller ID showed Callaway Enterprises executive line. Sophie noticed immediately. You should answer that, she said quietly. Ethan did not move right away. It can wait, he replied. But the phone kept vibrating again, more persistent this time. He finally stood and walked a few steps away before answering. What is it? He said, voice controlled. On the other end, his executive assistant spoke quickly. Sir, there is a situation at the Westbridge acquisition meeting. The board is requesting your immediate presence. There are concerns about the financial restructuring proposal. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Reschedule, he said. A pause followed. Sir, they are insisting this cannot be postponed. This is a critical negotiation. Ethan looked back toward Sophie in the hospital bed. She was watching him, calm but observant. He turned slightly away. I said reschedule, he repeated, firmer this time. I am not available. There was a moment of hesitation on the line before the assistant responded. Understood, sir. The call ended. Ethan lowered the phone slowly and placed it back on the table. Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounded important, she said. Ethan nodded once. It was. And you ignored it, she continued. Ethan looked at her. Yes. Sophie studied him carefully. That is not like you. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if even he was still adjusting to his own decision. A lot of things have not been like me lately, he admitted. Sophie gave a small, almost tired smile. That is true. A faint silence followed. Then Ethan pulled the chair slightly closer to her bed again. I told them I am not available, he said more softly. Because I am here. Sophie looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Consistency, she reminded him quietly. Ethan gave a faint nod in return. I am trying. Outside the room, the hospital continued its quiet rhythm of movement and distant conversations, but inside time felt suspended. Sophie shifted slightly. Do you regret it? She asked. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the question. Regret what? Not seeing this sooner, she said. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I regret a lot of things, he said honestly. But mostly I regret thinking that providing for you was the same as being with you. Sophie did not respond right away. The honesty in his voice carried something heavier than apology. It carried understanding. She nodded slowly. That is the first thing you have said tonight that actually feels true. Ethan let out a faint breath, almost like a quiet laugh without humor. I will take that as progress. Sophie shifted slightly again, more comfortable now. You are learning, she said. Ethan looked at her. So are you. She raised an eyebrow slightly. What am I learning? Ethan leaned back in his chair slightly. That I am not as in control of everything as I thought I was. Sophie gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. That one is hard for you. Extremely, he admitted. For a brief moment, something lighter passed between them. Not fixed, not healed, but less heavy. Ethan's phone remained silent for the next several minutes. No more calls. No more interruptions. Just the sound of the hospital and Sophie's steady breathing. He glanced at her again. Are you tired? He asked. Sophie nodded. A little. Ethan stood slowly and adjusted the chair closer to her bedside. Then rest, he said. Sophie looked at him for a moment before closing her eyes. You are still here, she murmured quietly. Ethan responded softly. I am not going anywhere tonight. And for the first time since everything began unraveling, that promise did not sound like control. It sounded like presence. The night had stretched long inside the hospital room, and even the city outside seemed to slow down as if it was waiting for something to happen. Sophie had finally drifted into a light sleep, her breathing steady but fragile, her hand still resting protectively over her abdomen. Ethan sat beside her, unmoving for a long time, watching the faint rise and fall of her chest as if he needed proof that everything was still stable. The monitor beside her bed blinked softly, casting faint green reflections across the walls. For a moment there was peace. Then it broke. The monitor suddenly emitted a sharp, irregular alert tone. It was not loud at first, but it was immediate enough to make Ethan stand up instantly. Sophie stirred, her eyes opening slowly. What is that? She whispered. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the numbers that had just shifted. Call the nurse, he said quickly, voice sharper now. Sophie tried to sit up. Ethan, what is happening? Before he could answer, the door opened and a nurse rushed in, her expression focused but controlled. We are seeing a drop in fetal stability markers, she said quickly. We need to move her for immediate evaluation. Ethan's entire posture changed instantly. What does that mean? He asked, stepping closer. The nurse looked at him. It means we need to act now. The room transformed in seconds from quiet to urgent motion. Sophie was carefully prepared for transport. Ethan stayed right beside her as they moved through the hallway at speed, the sound of rolling equipment echoing around them. Sophie reached for his hand as they moved. He did not hesitate. He took it immediately. "Stay calm," he said quietly. Sophie looked at him, fear flickering in her eyes. "I am trying," she whispered. They reached a diagnostic room where Dr. Carter was already waiting. His expression was focused but more serious than before. "We are seeing signs of stress response," he said immediately. "We need to stabilize her before this progresses." Ethan stepped forward. "Do it," he said without hesitation. Dr. Carter nodded and began directing the team. Sophie was placed under closer monitoring as machines adjusted around her. Ethan stayed close, still holding her hand. Sophie squeezed his fingers slightly. "Do not panic," she said weakly. Ethan looked at her. "I am not panicking," he said, though his voice was lower now. But his eyes told a different story. Minutes passed that felt heavier than hours. Every small sound from the machines felt amplified. Ethan did not move away. He did not check his phone. He did not speak unless spoken to. He just stayed. Finally, Dr. Carter adjusted the monitor and exhaled slightly. "Stabilizing," he said. The tension in the room did not disappear, but it shifted. Sophie closed her eyes briefly, her grip on Ethan's hand still tight. Ethan leaned closer. "You are okay," he said quietly. Sophie opened her eyes. "Do not say that unless you know," she replied softly. Ethan nodded once. "Then I will say I am here," he corrected. Sophie looked at him for a moment longer, then slowly relaxed back into the bed. The machine continued its steady rhythm again. Not perfect, but stable. Dr. Carter gave the final update. "We will continue observation overnight. No immediate intervention required for now." Ethan nodded. "I want someone in this room at all times," he said firmly. The nurse nodded. "We will arrange that." After the medical team stepped back, the room quieted again. Sophie lay still, exhausted from the sudden wave of fear. Ethan remained by her side, still holding her hand. After a long silence, Sophie spoke softly. "You did not leave," she said. Ethan looked at her. "I told you I would not." Sophie gave a faint, tired smile. "You are learning consistency," she whispered. Ethan tightened his grip on her hand slightly. "I am not letting anything happen to you," he said quietly. Sophie closed her eyes again. This time her breathing steadied more quickly. And Ethan stayed exactly where he was, as if moving even an inch away would break the fragile stability they had just fought to regain. The emergency room had finally fallen into a controlled rhythm again, but nothing about the atmosphere felt truly calm. Machines continued their steady beeping, nurses moved quietly in and out, and Sophie remained under close observation. Ethan had not left her side for more than a few seconds since the incident. He stood near the foot of her bed now, arms crossed tightly, eyes fixed on the monitors as if watching closely enough could prevent anything from going wrong again. Sophie lay back against the pillows, exhausted but stable, her hand still resting over her abdomen. The fear had not fully left her eyes yet. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Ethan's phone vibrated again. Once, then again. He glanced at it, already knowing what it was. The screen lit up with multiple notifications from his executive assistant and board members. Sophie noticed immediately. "It is your company again," she said quietly. Ethan did not answer right away. The phone kept vibrating in his hand like a reminder he had been ignoring for too long. Finally, he turned it face down on the counter. "It can wait," he said. Sophie raised her eyes slightly. "Ethan, you have not left this hospital in over a day." He looked at her. "And I am not leaving now." The firmness in his voice was different this time. It was not control. It was decision. Sophie studied him for a moment. "Your board does not wait," she said. Ethan gave a faint, almost humorless exhale. "They will today." As if summoned by that statement, his phone immediately lit up again, this time with a direct call. The screen showed the name of the chief financial officer. Ethan stared at it for a second before declining the call. Sophie blinked slightly. "That sounded important." Ethan nodded. "It is." "Then why are you ignoring it?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, his expression steady. "Because I already know what they are going to say." Sophie shifted slightly in bed, watching him more closely now. "And what is that?" Ethan walked a few steps away from her bed. then turned back. That I should be in the Westbridge acquisition meeting right now. That I am risking a $700 million deal by not being present. Sophie frowned slightly. And are you? Ethan paused. Then he shook his head once. Yes. A silence followed that answer. Sophie let it settle before speaking again. That is not something you usually walk away from. Ethan nodded slowly. No, it is not. He glanced at her again. But I also do not usually find my wife in a hospital bed after a fetal instability alert. Sophie did not respond immediately. The weight of that sentence hung between them. Outside, the city continued its normal pace, unaware of anything happening inside this room. Ethan finally walked back to her side and lowered himself into the chair again. This time he looked more tired than controlled. I have spent most of my life believing that if I built something strong enough outside, nothing would break inside, he said quietly. Sophie listened without interrupting. It does not work like that, she replied softly. Ethan nodded. I am starting to understand that. His phone vibrated again, but he did not move to check it. Instead, he looked at Sophie. I am not choosing between you and work, he said. I am correcting something I should have never separated in the first place. Sophie studied him for a long moment. And what happens when they realize you are not coming? She asked. Ethan gave a slight shrug. Then they will learn what I am learning right now. Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly. Which is? Ethan looked at her directly. That some things cannot be scheduled. A faint silence followed. Softer now. Less tense. Sophie slowly adjusted her position on the bed, exhaling carefully. You are still learning consistency, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. And I am still here. For the first time since the emergency, Sophie allowed a small, tired smile. Not because everything was resolved, but because for once she did not feel like she was holding everything together alone. The night had started to fade into a pale gray morning outside the hospital windows, though inside the room time still felt suspended. Sophie remained in bed under soft monitoring, the machines now steady and quiet, their rhythm no longer alarming but gently persistent, like a reminder that stability had been earned, not guaranteed. Ethan had not moved from his chair since the last update. His phone lay untouched on the table, still occasionally lighting up with notifications that he refused to answer. The world outside this room had clearly continued without him, but inside something else had begun to shift. Sophie turned her head slightly toward him. You did not sleep at all, she said quietly. Ethan looked up from where he had been staring at the floor. Neither did you, he replied. Sophie gave a faint, tired smile. That is not the same thing. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair. It feels the same tonight. A quiet pause followed, the kind that no longer felt heavy but reflective. Sophie adjusted slightly against the pillows, wincing just a little. Ethan noticed immediately and stood halfway before stopping himself. Do you need anything? He asked. Sophie shook her head. I just need the night to be over. Ethan nodded slowly. It is almost morning. Another silence settled between them, softer now. Sophie studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You missed your meeting, she said. Ethan gave a faint, almost distracted nod. Yes. The one worth $700 million, she added. Ethan looked at her then more fully. They will recover from it, he said. Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly. That is not how you usually talk. Ethan exhaled through his nose, almost like he was acknowledging that truth himself. I am learning new priorities, he said. Sophie looked away for a moment, then back at him. That sounds dangerous coming from you. A faint, tired smile crossed Ethan's face. It feels more honest than dangerous. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then spoke more softly. When I married you, I thought I understood what your life would be like, she said. Ethan listened without interrupting. I thought I could adjust to it, she continued. But I did not realize how alone someone could feel while still being married. The words landed without force, but they carried weight. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly. I did not realize it either, he said quietly. Sophie nodded. That is the part that hurts the most. Ethan looked at her again. I thought providing everything meant I was doing enough, he said. Sophie shook her head slightly. I never needed everything, she replied. I needed you to be there when it mattered. A long silence followed. This one deeper but not breaking. Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees again. I cannot change what I did not see, he said. But I can change what I do now. Sophie studied him carefully. That is what everyone says, she replied softly. Ethan nodded once. Then judge me by actions, not words. Sophie looked down at her hands for a moment. That is harder than it sounds. Ethan agreed quietly. I know. Outside, the first real light of morning began to spill into the room, soft and indirect. The city was waking up, but inside this space, nothing felt rushed anymore. Sophie finally leaned back into the pillows again, exhaustion returning now that the adrenaline had faded. I am still scared, she admitted quietly. Ethan did not hesitate this time. He stood and moved closer, not touching her yet, just close enough to be present. You are not alone in it, he said. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, she whispered. And for the first time since everything had begun unraveling, that word did not sound like acceptance of fear. It sounded like the beginning of trust. Morning finally arrived, but it did not bring relief. It only changed the color of the light in the hospital room from deep gray to a pale, exhausted gold. Sophie was still in bed, resting but awake now, her eyes open as she stared at the ceiling for a moment before turning her head toward Ethan. He was still there, still in the same chair, still watching her as if leaving for even a minute might undo everything they had rebuilt overnight. The silence between them was different now. Not tense, not heavy, just fragile, like something newly formed that neither of them wanted to break. Then the door opened without warning. A sharply dressed man in a suit stepped inside, followed by Ethan's assistant. Sophie immediately noticed the shift in Ethan's posture. Sir, the assistant said quickly, we have been trying to reach you since last night. The board meeting escalated. Westbridge is demanding clarification on your absence. Ethan did not respond right away. He slowly stood, his eyes still on Sophie for a brief moment before turning toward the assistant. I am aware, he said calmly. The assistant hesitated. They are requesting your immediate presence downtown. There are concerns about leadership continuity if this continues. Sophie watched quietly from the bed. She could see the pressure returning in real time, like the outside world forcing its way back into this room. Ethan looked at his phone again. Dozens of missed calls. Messages stacked one after another. Financial updates. Legal warnings. Board pressure. Everything he had ignored for more than 24 hours. He exhaled slowly. Tell them I will not be attending today, he said. The assistant blinked. Sir, that could trigger a vote of concern from the board. Ethan nodded once. Then let them vote. The room went silent. Even Sophie seemed surprised by the firmness in his voice. The assistant hesitated again. Understood, sir, he finally said before stepping back out. The door closed behind him. Ethan did not sit down immediately. He remained standing, looking at the space where the assistant had just been, as if confirming his own decision. Sophie spoke quietly. You are really doing this? Ethan turned slightly toward her. Yes. She studied him carefully. Your company does not survive easily without you. Ethan gave a faint, controlled breath. My company has survived too long without me being where I should be. Sophie's expression softened slightly, but there was still uncertainty in her eyes. And where exactly should you be? She asked. Ethan looked at her then. Not at the room. Not at the phone. At her. Here, he said simply. The word hung in the air longer than expected. Sophie did not respond immediately. Instead, she slowly shifted her position in bed, absorbing what he had just said. That is not something you can sustain forever, she said gently. Ethan nodded. I am not trying to sustain it forever, he replied. I am trying to correct what I ignored for too long. A long silence followed. Outside the hospital window, traffic had begun to build again, the city fully awake now. Inside, everything felt quieter than before. Sophie finally spoke again. What happens when the pressure gets worse? She asked. Ethan did not hesitate. Then I handle it differently than I used to. Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly. Which is how. Ethan pulled a chair closer to her bed again, sitting down this time with less tension in his shoulders. By not letting it pull me away from you, he said. Sophie studied him for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. That will be the real test, she said. Ethan gave a faint, almost thoughtful expression. I know. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The hospital noises outside continued, but inside the room there was something shifting again. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just steady. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. I canceled 3 meetings this morning, he said quietly. Sophie looked at him. Only 3. A faint smile crossed his face. For now. Sophie gave a soft exhale, almost like a quiet laugh. You are learning, she said again. Ethan nodded once. Slowly. And for the first time, the outside world did not feel like it was pulling him away. It felt like something he was finally choosing to face differently. Morning light filled the hospital room with a soft, pale glow, but it did little to ease the weight that still lingered inside it. Sophie was awake now, resting against the pillows, her hand lightly placed over her abdomen as she watched the quiet movement of Ethan across the room. He had not left since early morning, not even when his phone had continued to vibrate with increasing urgency. There was a calmness in him now that felt different from before. Not absence of responsibility, but a refusal to be pulled away. A knock interrupted the stillness. 2 men entered the room, both dressed in formal business attire. One of them carried a leather briefcase. Ethan immediately recognized them. We need to speak with you privately, sir, one of them said. Ethan did not move. Anything you have to say you can say here, he replied. Sophie watched carefully, sensing the shift in energy. The man with the briefcase exchanged a glance with his colleague before stepping forward slightly. The board has convened an emergency review, he said. Your absence has triggered formal concern regarding leadership continuity at Callaway Enterprises. Ethan's expression did not change. And the second man cleared his throat. They are prepared to initiate a vote regarding temporary executive control if you do not return today. The room fell silent. Sophie looked between them, then at Ethan. This was not just pressure. This was corporate escalation at the highest level. Ethan slowly exhaled, then turned slightly toward Sophie before answering. I am aware of the consequences, he said. The man with the briefcase nodded carefully. Then you understand the urgency. Ethan stepped closer to the counter near Sophie's bed, placing his hands lightly on it. For a moment he did not speak. Sophie broke the silence softly. You should go, she said. Ethan turned to her immediately. No, she frowned slightly. Ethan, this is your company. And you are here, he replied simply. The 2 executives shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware they were witnessing something unexpected. Sophie studied Ethan for a long moment. This is not about choosing me over them, she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. It is not about choosing at all, he replied. It is about priorities I should have understood earlier. Sophie leaned back slightly, processing his words. They will not wait forever, she said. Ethan nodded. I know. A pause followed. Then he continued. Which is why I am not ignoring them. I am redirecting them. He turned toward the executives. Schedule a full board meeting for tomorrow morning. I will address everything then. The man with the briefcase hesitated. Sir, they requested immediate action. Ethan's tone remained calm. They will get immediate clarity tomorrow. That is final. The executives exchanged another look, then nodded and left the room. The door closed behind them, leaving silence again. Sophie finally spoke. You are making powerful people very uncomfortable. Ethan gave a faint, almost restrained smile. They will adjust. Sophie shook her head slightly. That is not how they usually respond. Ethan walked back toward her, sitting down in the chair beside her bed again. Then they will learn a new version of me, he said quietly. Sophie studied him carefully. And what version is that? Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at her instead, as if the answer had already been forming for a while. One that does not disappear when things matter most, he said. Sophie did not respond right away. The honesty in his voice was steady, not dramatic. It did not demand belief. simply existed. Outside the window, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware of the decisions being made inside this small room. Sophie finally exhaled slowly. "That is going to cost you," she said. Ethan nodded. "It already is." A faint silence followed, softer than before. Sophie shifted slightly in bed. "Are you sure about tomorrow?" she asked. Ethan did not hesitate. "Yes. Even if they push back," she continued. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "They can push," he said. "But they will not move me away from this room today." Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave a small, tired nod. "Consistency," she whispered. Ethan nodded once. "I am here," he said again. And this time it no longer sounded like a promise he was trying to prove. It sounded like a decision already made. Morning light had fully taken over the hospital room, turning everything soft and quiet, almost unreal after the intensity of the past days. Sophie was no longer under emergency monitoring, only routine observation now. The machines beside her bed pulsed steadily, no longer alarming, just present. Ethan had stayed true to his word. He had not left once. Not for meetings. Not for calls. Not even for the board that continued to escalate pressure through his phone, which he had turned off hours ago. He stood by the window now, looking out at the city that had already started its morning rush. Sophie watched him for a moment before speaking. "They are going to think you lost your mind," she said softly. Ethan turned slightly, not surprised by the comment. "They already think that," he replied. Sophie gave a faint, tired smile. "And you do not care?" Ethan paused. "I care," he said. "Just not in the way they expect me to." A knock came at the door again. This time it was not an executive. It was Dr. Carter. He entered calmly, holding Sophie's updated chart. "Good morning," he said. "We are seeing stable readings overnight. No further complications at this time." Sophie exhaled slowly, relief soft but visible. Ethan stepped closer. "So she is stable?" he asked. Dr. Carter nodded. "Yes. But continued stress management is essential. Emotional environment matters as much as physical at this stage." Ethan nodded once, absorbing the words without argument. Sophie looked between them. "So no more surprises," she said quietly. Dr. Carter smiled slightly. "Ideally, yes." After the doctor left, the room returned to silence, but it felt different now. Less tense. More grounded. Sophie shifted slightly in bed. "You have not checked your phone in hours," she said. Ethan glanced at it on the counter. "Still off." "It can stay off," he said. Sophie raised an eyebrow slightly. "That is not something I thought I would ever hear you say." Ethan gave a faint exhale. "Neither did I." A pause followed. Then Sophie spoke again, softer this time. "What happens when you go back?" she asked. Ethan turned toward her fully now. "I am not leaving today," he said. Sophie studied him carefully. "I mean eventually." Ethan nodded slowly. "Eventually, I will have to deal with everything I stepped away from." Sophie waited. "And," she prompted. Ethan walked back toward her bed and sat down in the chair beside her again. "And I will do it differently," he said. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. "That is not an answer," she said gently. Ethan gave a faint, almost self-aware smile. "It is the only one I have right now." Silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt heavy. Felt like space. Sophie shifted slightly, more comfortable now. "You really canceled everything," she said. Ethan nodded. "Yes." Without knowing how long this would take, she added. "Yes," he repeated. Sophie gave a small nod, as if processing that fully. "That is new for you," she said. Ethan leaned back slightly. "So is this," he replied, glancing toward her and the steady monitor beside her bed. Sophie followed his gaze. "You are not afraid of the board anymore," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I am," he admitted. "But I am more afraid of not being here when I am needed." That sentence hung in the air longer than expected. Sophie did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands, then back at him. "That is what I needed to hear weeks ago," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I know." A long silence followed. Outside, the city moved forward without pause. Inside, something had finally slowed down enough to be noticed. Sophie spoke again, softer this time. "What happens now?" she asked. Ethan looked at her without hesitation. "Now," he said, "I stay. Not as a reaction. Not as a correction.